I'm going to start personal and then get economic on you.
I came up with a couple of different punchlines for that opening, so I'll give you both. You want to get personal and then economic on me? Well, at least you're not going to get medieval on my ass. Or, you want to get personal and then economic on me? Is that the polite way of describing solicitation of prostitution? Take whichever one of those you like best, or hate the least, and pretend that's how I started this video. Our speaker begins her talk with a relatively lengthy recitation of her family history, how her ancestors built the railroads, were forced into child labor, or were put into the Japanese internment camps of World War II. It's legitimately tragic, but there's nothing about it to critique, and, at the risk of sounding callous, it's also irrelevant to the points she eventually gets to. So, I'm going to skip most of that. If you would like to see the full talk, a link is in the description.
So my family's history is a history of race in this country, and it's a history of class in this country. So much of what has been said in this conference, much of what will be said, applies to my family and to myself.
Well, given the state of things these days, race and class apply to everyone, though individual results may vary. So, welcome to the club.
So yes, these things on race do apply to Asian Americans as well. We had no human capital education, no capital, wealth, no social capital, connections, and of course, as many people will talk about, those are important in this country to get ahead.
Wait. Asians have no education, wealth, or social connections. I'm going to have to give her the benefit of the doubt, until I hear otherwise, that she was referring to the situation of Asian immigrants from the past. Because, according to the Pew Research Center, though Asian Americans make up only 5.8% of the total U.S. population, 61% of those have a college degree of some kind, while 49% have a bachelor's degree. That's compared to only 28% of the total U.S. population. And the median income of Asian Americans tops the entire country's average by an extra $16,000. As far as social connections, the closest thing I could find was a Pew study regarding the usage of various social media platforms, as divided along racial and gender lines. However, similar to the U.S. Census, Pew has broken those down into only 3 categories: white non-Hispanic, black non-Hispanic, and Hispanic. But if she's saying that Asians can't, or don't, socialize in the real world, I'm curious to know how she has any authority to make that claim. So, again, I am going to assume she's talking about the past, and not the present.
I'm 4th generation Asian American. I will always be seen as foreign, as not American, as other.
No, you will always project onto others your own insecurities about being seen as foreign, or as not American, or as the other. You have no idea what other people are thinking. You are only assuming the worst of everyone you come across. So then, who do we know has a biased perspective on others? That's right, you do.
So Asians are invisible. We're the invisible minorities. We're invisible because people don't think we suffer.
You do not know what other people think, and I can see you just fine. I can hear you just fine as well.
So as Bill has said, some are doing well if they had education and wealth. But many are doing badly, like those from Southeast Asia. So we're a very bimodal population.
People with wealth and education do better than people who do not have those things. It may come as a shock to you, but that rule applies to everyone, regardless of your race.
During the Great Recession, we had the highest rate of long-term unemployment, for instance.
Okay, so far, that single claim by our speaker has required the most research on my part. So far. I am going to try to break this down as efficiently as I can. I even made some visual aids to help. So, here we go. As previously mentioned, Asian Americans make up 5.8% of the total U.S. population. Of that 5.8%, the unemployment rate is 4%. Now, of that 4%, 14.7% has been unemployed longer than 99 weeks, which is the highest tier of measurement for unemployment in the United States. And relative to all other racial demographics, the Asian American population does indeed have the highest unemployment rate in the country. But the question is, why might that be? Our speaker is pointing the finger squarely on discrimination and racism. Now, if the thoughts and motivations of people were something that could be accurately measured, maybe there would be a case there, but it's difficult to say. Is there any known, measurable factor that might be contributing to this? Well, let's consider the fact that 1/3 of all Asian Americans live in the state of California. So, roughly 33% of that 5.8% of the U.S. population. And then consider that the unemployment rate just in the state of California is 5.3%. So, if 4% of the Asian American population is unemployed at any given time, and 33% of the Asian American population lives in a single state where the average unemployment rate is 5.3% for everyone, is it possible that a good chunk of the Asian American unemployment comes down to the employment trends of that single state's economy? It's possible. I am not saying there is no discrimination against Asian Americans at all. I'm just saying that there might be other, less inflammatory causes involved.
We're also invisible
I can see you just fine.
because we're so few, so we don't count.
If you don't count, then why are there so many articles and statistical breakdowns about what is going on with the Asian American demographic? You have been counted, just like everyone else.
So last night, the Reverend discussed race and class. Today, I want to add a gender dimension to the discussions on this conference and the intersection of race and gender.
Ah, intersection. The art of conflating different things into a whole thing in order to compound how awful the entire world is. Proceed.
In this research, there are not good theories about gender and race. In economics, they tend to explain either gender or race, but not both at the same time.
Race and gender are not considered in economics. Really? Well, let's see. Unemployment. Okay, there's a column for Asians. And, well, golly, there's a row regarding male Asians. And one for female Asians. I guess someone has compiled statistical data on race and gender in economics at the same time. Now, granted, this is just employment statistics, but hey, I'll bet there are other areas that have been measured using these same criteria. But let me back up slightly. You claim there are no good theories on disparities by race and gender. Now, are we still talking about Asian unemployment? Because one theory is California. Now, is that a good theory or a bad theory? And are you going to list off any of the theories that you don't think are good?
So many of us turn to other disciplines to explain gender and race and the intersection much better.
Wait, better than what? You haven't said what economic theories there are, even if you think they're bad ones. And many of us have turned to other disciplines. How many is many? And who exactly is us?
These include law, philosophy, multicultural studies, feminist studies, critical theory.
So, unscientific disciplines based on subjectivity rather than objectivity. Sounds completely legit.
So scholars in these other disciplines talk about the fact that women of color suffer from two different sources of bias or discrimination.
Oh, I am sure these scholars of law, philosophy, critical theory, and feminist theory talk about a lot of things. But do they have any data to offer to back up their claims? And women of color face two types of discrimination? Just a wild guess. Would those be gender and race?
One is by race,
Nailed it.
and as Thomas discussed, there's inequality by race in wealth. That's certainly true of earnings as well.
It's true. Asian Americans make more, on average, than anyone else in the U.S.
Using the same methodology, you find that African Americans have lower earnings because they get different rewards, lower opportunities in the work market.
Does anything in your PowerPoint presentation provide any proof of these claims? Are you even going to just, offhandedly cite any sources or studies to back up your claims?
The same is true for Latinos who have accents. The same is true for many Asian Americans as well.
Many. How many? Proof? Any proof?
In addition, there's, of course, a glass ceiling, certainly by gender, but also by Asian Americans.
Oh, of course. Certainly. Proof? Any proof?
The same other scholars, of course, find that there's gender disparities, that the same is true, that the same achievements give different rewards, lower rewards for women. So, for instance...
For instance? Oh, thank goodness. We might actually be getting an example. Finally.
Women graduating from the same university with the same GPA and the same major earn less than men. So you can't say it's a different choice or different interests.
Okay, how can you possibly know that? I mean, I got an English degree in college, as untechnical a pursuit as you might choose. I now work in information technology. My choices after college, the jobs I took and decisions I made in my personal life, led me to where I am today. Probably a lot better off financially than if I had pursued things that are classically associated with an English degree, but certainly less so than if I had gone after an engineering degree. But then, I know a guy who became a master electrical engineer, but he decided he didn't like it, and so he became a professional photographer. But anecdotals aside, are there any other factors you can think of, in regards to women specifically, that might affect their overall career earnings, even if they possess all the same qualifications as their male counterparts? How about wanting to have children and raise a family, and dropping out of the workforce to do that? Now, I am glad you said earned and not paid, though that only confuses me more on how you're implying these outcomes are somehow unfair, or not based in some way on personal choice and initiative.
You find that women have higher performance appraisals from their employers.
Well, how can that be? I thought women were disproportionately discriminated against. Why would they receive any commendations at all?
But they get lower raises from those higher performance appraisals and are less likely to be promoted.
Well, do women take the same amount of initiative as men do when pursuing raises and promotions? Are you going to offer any data or evidence to say that one way or the other? No? Okay.
So we do find disparities by race and by gender, but many scholars also believe that there's an intersectional component as well between race and gender.
Many. How many? And believe or can prove with evidence?
The effect of race and gender for women of color may not be the sum of their race and gender parts.
What?
That the effect of race and gender can be less than the total amount of bias or discrimination women of color face.
The total amount. How much does discrimination weigh exactly?
Or the effect of race and gender can be greater than the total amount of bias or discrimination they face.
If I place discrimination into a bathtub full of water, what is its volume?
This can be the case, for instance, if race and gender count for affirmative action, so you're more likely to be hired or favored than someone who's just African American or just female.
That didn't make any sense. Let's try that one again.
This can be the case, for instance, if race and gender count for affirmative action.
Race and gender count towards affirmative action. Okay, got it.
So you're more likely to be hired or favored.
You're more likely to be hired or favored due to your race and gender. Got it.
Than someone who's just African American or just female.
African American is a race. Female is a gender. So I am more likely to be hired through affirmative action based on my race or gender than someone who is just African American or who is just female. What?
In the former case, that race and gender penalties are less than the total amount of discrimination or bias you face.
If I threw a bag of bias at you, and then a bag of feathers, which would cause more blunt force trauma?
This could mean that the particular combination of being African American and a woman is particularly bad or awful or odious. You don't know how to deal with people who have multiple oppressions.
This could mean. Could. Well, rain clouds on a sunny day could mean a bad omen for the health of my pet snake. I mean, it could mean that.
The other thing is that people believe that the interaction between gender and race is complex.
And many people believe that 9/11 was an inside job. What's your point?
That it can change. It could vary depending on what you're looking at, hiring, promotion, training, mentoring, so that sometimes race is more relevant in the outcome, sometimes gender is more relevant in the outcome, such as work and family issues, for instance, and sometimes the intersection of race and gender can produce unique outcomes.
A lot of sounds were just produced there, but nothing was really said.
What we need to think about is, why are women always on the bottom of the socioeconomic hierarchy? Why are racial and ethnic minorities always on the bottom of socioeconomic hierarchies? Why is this true of every society throughout time?
Oh, you're asking why? Oh, okay. This must be the part where you give us answers. Thank God, I was getting ready to give up on this video. There's only so much value to be had of me saying, please give me proof to every claim you make. Okay, I am ready to be educated.
So to explain this, I agree with Jack on what he said yesterday, that the critical theories, the theories that look at power and wealth and how power is replicated, how it's perpetuated, how groups that oppose the status quo are punished or killed, are better explanations of why this is true. Gender disparities, race disparities, and especially the intersection of race and gender, and are better explanations than many of the economic theories we have.
What explanations? What theories? Jack had the answers? Can you maybe quote Jack? Please?
So most research claims that you can't measure the intersection between gender and race.
Most research claims this. So 51% or more of all the research claims this. Is that why there are no good theories about the intersection of race and gender? Because most of the research looked at the question and found that there wasn't anything to it?
The result is that very little work has been done in this area. So what do you do when you're interested in something and you're told you can't do it? You do it anyway.
Oh, yes. That method works really well when pointing a loaded gun at someone as a joke or skiing outside of the marked trails. You go, girl.
So what I found is that African American women suffer a gender penalty of 15%. Their earnings are 15% lower because of their gender.
Do you have any proof that their gender is the reason for their lower amount of earnings? Or are you just pointing to a statistic and assuming it is its own cause?
They suffer an additional penalty because of their race of 9%.
My previous question still stands.
But in addition, they suffer an intersectional component of 3%, so that their earnings are 3% lower because of the intersection of their race and gender.
How did you arrive at 3%? And 3% of what exactly? Okay, let me try this. If for every dollar earned by the average person, a black woman loses 19 cents to gender, 9 cents to her race, and 3 cents to the combination of her gender and race, that's 31 cents. So black women make 69% of what other people make. Well, the 2012 numbers on earnings for black females are $40,473 in the mean and $33,251 in the median, corresponding to the national averages of $47,001 in the mean and $37,412 in the median. That's 86% and 88% respectively, not 69%. But then I don't know how you arrived at your numbers, so I can only speculate.
To do this research, I used the same technique that Tom uses.
Okay, you're going to explain yourself now. Thank goodness.
But I add a new twist to it, and I try to explain wage differences by race and gender and the intersection. And what this does, this is the old one, all right. This methodology does two things.
But what methodology? What was your method? Do I have to look for Tom's presentation and Jack's presentation in order to understand your presentation?
It accounts for wages after taking in consideration all the factors that can explain race and gender differences.
Finally, a reference to something. Okay, the Blinder-Oaxaca decomposition. Okay, so what is that? The Blinder-Oaxaca decomposition technique, or simply the Oaxaca decomposition, decomposes wage differentials into two components: a portion that arises because two comparison groups, on average, have different qualifications or credentials, e.g. years of schooling and experience in the labor market, when both groups receive the same treatment, explained component, and a portion that arises because one group is more favorably treated than the other given the same individual characteristics, unexplained component. So this method of analysis, from what I can see, is generally accepted and applied to evaluating wage differentials, as well as many other things, but wages were its initial purpose. Okay, now maybe we're getting somewhere.
Such as education level, work experience, living in high wage versus low wage areas. So you're trying to account for factors that could explain race or gender differentials. But you also want to do a second thing. When accounting for these factors, you examine what would the wages be of African American women if they had, as Tom said, the same returns as other workers, if they were treated the same in the labor markets as other workers. So what I look at is, what are the wages of African American women if they're treated as white women? That's the measure of the race gap. What are the wages of African American women if they were treated as African American men? This is the gender gap. And finally, what are the wages of African American women if they were treated as white men or had the same returns as white men? This then is the total wage gap, those due to gender and race. I then look at this total wage gap and I compare it to the sum of the race and gender gaps to see if the total gap is greater, less, or equal to the sum of the race and gender gaps. I'm getting some nods. Okay. Some of you are with me.
Okay, so far I am with you, in the sense that you are taking numbers from two different variables and then conjuring up a third combined variable out of thin air. You are then using that to say that things are even worse than anyone else thinks they are, as if you have discovered something that no one had ever seen before, rather than making it up out of whole cloth. Yes, I think I am with you.
I look from 1980 to 2014. I had to use different data sets because the 2000, they didn't have some of the variables I needed. And the results are kind of interesting. For African American women, again, there are race penalties for their earnings. They have lower wages because of their race.
You do not know, and you have offered no proof to say, that their race is the cause of the statistic, that they are being penalized because of their race. But by that logic, is the average American being penalized for not being Asian?
They have lower wages because of their gender. And the race plus the gender earnings is less than the total penalties they face. So once again, instead of double discrimination, facing discrimination or bias because of the race and gender, there's triple discrimination or triple penalties because of the race, their gender, and the intersection of the race and gender.
So you say.
So if this isn't clear, it means you're penalized to be a woman. It's bad to be a woman in the labor force. Your earnings are less. It's bad to be African American in the labor force. Your wages are even lower. And it's worse to be both a woman and African American. Your penalized even more.
Now, maybe she'll come back to this. I am writing this script in real time of watching this video for the first time. But I find it interesting that she began this talk highlighting the plights of Asian Americans, but save for the unemployment rate of Asians as compared to other racial demographics, she's been focusing on the money earned by black women. Why isn't she focusing on the money earned by Asian American women?
I looked at changes in these penalties and over time, and what you find, which is interesting, is that the intersectional penalty is steady. It doesn't change over time. The gender penalty goes down, which is consistent with other studies that show that women face lower penalties in the workforce than they used to. What's interesting, though, is that the race penalty for African American women has gone up.
So the gender penalty has gone down, and the race penalty has gone up, and the intersectional penalty has remained steady. If the intersectional penalty is just a combination of the other two penalties, which have been rising and falling in relation to one another, then of course the intersectional penalty will remain steady. Holy catfish.
Some people think that it's because white women were able to get into higher paid professional jobs more easily than African American women. So the race difference between white and African American women went up over these years.
Some people think that, do they? Does anyone know that?
So to conclude, there are penalties in the earnings of African American women.
You have shown nothing to conclude that it is a penalty.
There are penalties in the earnings of women as well.
You haven't proven that either.
And there's an additional penalty with the combination of being an African American woman.
And you haven't proven that either.
That over time, the gender penalty has gone down. The intersectional penalty of being African American and a woman has remained the same, but the race penalty for African American women has gone up from 1980 to the present. So what does this mean? I want to answer Robert Johnson's question that he raised last night. What does this mean? Things are worse than we think?
Well, of course they are. They have to be. The war is not meant to be won. It is meant to be continuous.
There is a gender penalty, there's a race penalty, and there's an additional problem of the intersection.
For as many times as you have had to repeat that, the less and less I believe you can actually prove it. And you're just trying to convince the audience, and yourself, that you are justified in holding the position that you do, both ideologically and professionally.
And so this is important, that economics is not explaining these. I think it's because we have bankrupt theories, because we've had positivism where you have to predict things rather than going back to an institutional approach where you look around and you explain what you see and what's going on.
So the scientific method. Got it.
We probably need to change our assumptions and our approach in economics, because models that are based on atomistic, independent people maximizing utility, being greedy, and that leads to the best of all worlds. You get one outcome in inequality, for instance, and models based on a compassionate economy where people care for other people for free, such as women, such as neighbors, such as minority communities helping each other, you get different outcomes as well.
Are you advocating for an economy based on the welfare of the community over personal initiative? I wonder what you would call a community-based economy. I wonder.
So when Robert Johnson says, what can we do? What can the economics profession do? Let's change our assumptions. Let's change our models. And let's change the practice of this institution. The American Economic Review is no longer anonymous. And we know that people with women's names, ethnic names, are less likely, their work is less likely to be seen as good compared to Anglo names.
Well, that's an 11th hour claim that I'm not going to waste my time on. But given everything else that has come before this, I'm sure it's entirely accurate.
And we have a job market in economics that assumes you have money to fly across the country and stay at a hotel and interview for jobs, which is not necessarily true for everyone in the profession.
What? That was an odd little factoid. Sounded almost personal. Did someone not pay for your plane ticket and hotel room so you could attend this conference? Is that it?
So finally, we can't compartmentalize gender, race, and the intersection of gender and race. It is complex.
You explain that you took two statistical numbers and squished them together in order to create a third number and call it an additional dimension of penalization. Doesn't sound complex to me at all. I mean, let's see. 4 plus 4 is 8, and 8 is the number that makes cats meow. See? I can do it too.
We've been looking to other disciplines to explain reality much better, but the economics profession can fund and publish better analyses that can explain this reality, and I think this conference is a great step in going forward with that. Thank you.
So remember, kids, you can speak at length at a podium about the plight of one demographic, sidestep into analyzing the statistical numbers in regards to a different demographic, combine two numbers to make a third number and call this a new discovery, and from all of this justify a career as an economics professor. Ah, America. What a country. As always, thank you for watching.